6 najbardziej niepokojących momentów ujętych na żywo w telewizji. Ostatnio były live streamy, teraz wbijamy się w wielki świat.
On the 30th of June 2025, a reporter named Linildo Frazão went live from the Miriam River in Brazil to cover a tragic incident that happened there just a day earlier. In the early hours of June 29, a group of teenagers had decided to go for a swim in the river.
No.
Unfortunately, they underestimated its depth, resulting in the disappearance of 13-year-old Raisa Fernandez.
O kurwa.
Seconds after entering the water, her friends watched her dip
No,
beneath
ludzie sobie myślą, dobra, popłynę rzeką, co złego może się stać? No, tyle, że nie masz pojęcia, jak to jest głębokie często. To nie jest tak, że każda rzeczka to jest mały strumyczek, który jest, wiesz, niewielki i do pasa ci sięgnie. Czasami te rzeki są pojebanie głębokie.
the surface, and that was the last time anyone saw her alive. Divers looked for her underwater, while rescuers scoured the riverbank, hoping she might have washed ashore somewhere. But even after hours of searching, Raisa was nowhere to be found. Linildo intended to use this broadcast as an opportunity
No ale niestety, to jest to, nie? Nastolatki odważne za bardzo, w zasadzie pomyliły odwagę z odważnikiem i kurwa laska pewnie nie żyje.
to educate viewers on the dangers of river currents and general river safety, not knowing that he was about to solve the mystery of Raisa's disappearance on live TV.
Czekaj, co? Chłop chciał zrobić reportaż na ten temat, a odkryje ciało?
He took off his shoes and started slowly walking into the river while talking about the sudden increase in depth and how dangerous it can be for inexperienced
buty.
swimmers.
Quanto mais você desce, mais fundo fica. Ó, aqui, ó. Até que aqui é de boa, mas só que é uma descida. Aqui onde ela se afogou, gente, é uma descida. Pra você ver aqui, ó. O tanto que eu passei aqui, daqui dá mais ou menos uns 2,5 metros. Ó, e quanto mais você anda, ó a diferença aqui já onde eu estou agora, ó.
Spójrz na różnicę,
Então,
gdzie tu
pessoal,
stoję.
e ainda tem a correnteza. Aqui já, olha,
Jeszcze są
ó, passinho
prądy.
pra frente, a água já tá
Jeden mały
praticamente
krok
no
do
fundo. Então, o
przodu i
risco
woda mnie
aqui
całego pokryła.
é muito grande, é muito grande.
However, nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to encounter just seconds later.
No to jest właśnie to, nie? Prądy i bardzo duża różnica, o której on mówi. Jeden krok i nagle pup!
Ó a fundura aqui, ó.
Slope.
Ui.
Czy on się o nią potknął, kurwa?
Eu acho que tinha um negócio aqui no fundo da água.
Ja pierdolę.
Não, era mole.
O kurwa.
Será que não é ela, não?
To
While
jest
trying to
popierdolone.
demonstrate the river's deceptive drop-off, Linildo accidentally stepped on something lying on the riverbed. It was too soft and organic feeling to be a rock or a submerged log, which caught him off guard. The murky water made it impossible to see beneath the surface. But Linildo was
Ale
starting
jak właśnie ludzie jej szukali, pewnie prądy ją mogły jakoś przesunąć, nie wiem, coś.
to realize what it could be, leaving him too disturbed to go back and investigate further. He got out of the water and contacted authorities immediately. And it wasn't long before divers recovered the remains of Raisa from
No
that
niby
exact
tak,
spot.
niby tu się
Later
utopiła.
autopsy report confirmed that there was no foul play involved. What happened to her was nothing more than a tragic accident.
Popieprzone.
On September 25, 2025, the CBS 6 station in Albany, New York received a strange email with a 2-page document. It contained a nearly incomprehensible rant featuring Arnold Schwarzenegger, archaic centuries-old laws, and a proposal to create a board of trustees with prosecutorial
What the
immunity.
fuck?
However, the most important aspect of this document wasn't its content. Instead, the reason it stood out among the hundreds of emails the channel received every day was its author, 53-year-old Lawrence Krauss, who also included a selfie alongside the document. You see, Lawrence was currently under investigation for ending the lives of his own parents and getting away with it for over 8 years.
Co?
It happened in August 2017.
O kurwa.
His 86-year-old father
Zodiac.
and 83-year-old mother were living out their retirement in their home in
Dał znać
Crestwood
medium.
Court in Albany, New York. And suddenly, they were gone without a trace. None of the neighbors saw them leaving or heard anything about where they were going. Their house was also left abandoned, with Lawrence only visiting it occasionally to collect mail, mow the lawn, and clear the snow. When asked about his parents, he claimed that they had moved back to Germany and won't be coming back. The neighbors had no reason to distrust Lawrence, so no one questioned their absence and life went on as usual. A distant relative even requested a welfare check in 2020. But the neighbors repeated the same explanation Lawrence had given, ending the officer's questioning without any further suspicion. It wasn't until mid-2025 that the Albany police became aware of something shady going on with the Krause family. Someone had been collecting
Popierdolone, że gość tak naprawdę, wiesz, załatwił swoją rodzinę, wmówił całemu otoczeniu, że oni wyjechali i to wyszło i wszystkie jakieś sprawdzenia przez lata nie miały nawet znaczenia. Podchodzili, sąsiedzi mówili, oni wyjechali, ich już nie ma. Wiesz, czemu masz zakładać, że tak nie jest, nie?
Lawrence's parents' social security payments, even though the two hadn't been seen in years. This resulted in the police launching a
A kaskę odbierał, no i widzisz.
formal investigation, and after months, finally executing a search warrant
Coś
at the Krause
musiał
home on September
odpierdolić.
23rd. Over the next 48 hours,
Słyszałem o tym Austriaku, co swoją córkę trzymał 20 lat w piwnicy, to jest pokurwione. Fritz czy Fritzl? On jakoś miał tak. Gra chyba nawet o tym była i ja się wtedy o tym dowiedziałem w ogóle. To jest totalnie popierdolone.
detectives collected thousands of financial documents and other evidence. More importantly, they discovered the remains of Lawrence's parents buried in the backyard. Lawrence likely knew that he was the prime suspect in this case, but instead of turning himself in or trying to run away, he made the unusual decision of sending this document to the local news network alongside
Gość
his
chory
contact
psychicznie na
information.
pewno.
One of the directors at CBS 6 was familiar with the Krause case and immediately jumped at the opportunity to interview Lawrence. After giving him a call, Lawrence claimed that he was willing to do a live interview with the channel only if they published his document on the internet for everyone to see. The network agreed, and less than an hour later, Lawrence was sitting with a CBS 6 reporter for a live interview. Lawrence was a bit hesitant at first, but after some pressure, he cracked and confessed to everything.
I want to hear from you.
Yeah.
What did you do to your parents?
I buried them in their property.
You buried them in the backyard.
I to jest najbardziej popieprzone, że ci ludzie mówią to z totalnym spokojem, czasem nawet uśmiechem na twarzy. Patrz na tego zioma, on ma totalny chill. Bo ci psychopaci nie odróżniają dobra od zła. Oni nie mają takiego kompasu.
That house in Albany.
Right.
When it actually happened, when your parents died, did they know it was
Dla mnie
happening to
pojebane,
them?
że on tu zakuty nie siedzi. To jest popieprzone, wiesz, jakie to jest dla mediów fajne, że oni mają taki ekskluzywny wywiad. Oni nawet nie patrzą na to, kim ten człowiek jest i na co zasługuje.
Oh yeah.
And they knew it was at your hand?
Well, yes, no one else's.
Right. So they realized what you were doing to them as it happened.
Yes.
They knew that this was it for them, that they were perishing at your hand.
Yes. And it was so quick.
How did you do it?
Yeah, I can't talk about that.
Well, you've just told us that
Right.
it was at your hand.
Right.
Were there drugs involved? Was
No.
there a suffocation? You suffocated them? You
Udusił.
suffocated your parents?
Yeah.
Ja
What made this
pierdolę.
confession so disturbing, however, was the way Lorenz tried to portray it as something righteous. His argument essentially boiled down to, my parents were suffering from old age, so I did them a favor. Even though the neighbors described the couple as elderly, they were by no means sick or bedridden. They had normal routines where they tended to their garden, shared mint leaves with neighbors' kids, and listened to
Ale
Polish
dobra, nawet jeśli by byli zniedołężniali, no tak się nie robi, nie? Mi się wydaje, że on się sam zgaslightował po uczynieniu czegoś chorego, żeby sobie przypadkiem, wiesz, nie dać się zjeść wyrzutom winy i tak długo sobie to kłamstwo powtarzał, że w nie uwierzył.
music every day. Their lives weren't nearly as miserable as Lorenz tried to portray during this interview. Now, it's unclear if he's severely mentally ill and genuinely believed everything he was saying, or if this interview was his way
Ej, bo ja nie umiem czytać tych napisów, ale ten miły pan z prawej strony na wywiadzie to jakiś naukowiec albo lekarz? No, no.
of trying to paint himself as the concerned son to earn the public's favor before his inevitable arrest. In either case, he had no way of escaping the consequences of his heartless actions. He was arrested immediately after walking out of the network's building and is currently awaiting trial for the death of his parents.
Oby kurwa zgnił w pierdlu, co za dziwak.
On the night of October 28, 2023, the Utilita Arena in Sheffield, England was packed with over 8,000 spectators.
No.
They were there to watch the ice hockey match between the Nottingham Panthers and the Sheffield Steelers.
Anglia.
The whole thing was also being broadcast live on TV for fans across the world. And the match started off completely normal. The first period ended
Smacznego,
without
Loki.
either team scoring a point. About 35 minutes later, the score was 4-2 in favor of the Sheffield Steelers. The
Definitely.
Panthers needed to score soon if they wanted to make a comeback. So, one of their more renowned players, Adam Johnson, got a hold of the puck and started pushing into the Steelers' defensive zone. But before he could reach the goal, the match got interrupted by one of the most tragic incidents in
Co się
ice hockey
stało?
history. As Adam was making his way to the goal, a different player of his team bumped into Matt Petgrave of the Steelers. This resulted in Matt getting launched in the air and slicing Adam's neck with one of his skates.
O
For those who
kurwa!
don't know, professional hockey
No
skates
nie, no te łyżwy są pojebanie ostre, to łeb może upierdolić.
are sharpened to a razor's edge.
Co ty
So
gadasz,
it took very
kurwa?
little force to leave a deep laceration across Adam's neck, causing him to bleed profusely in front of both the live crowd and the TV audience. Medics at the arena tried to stop the bleeding, but the cut was too deep. He had already lost
Jezu.
a lot of blood on the ice. Adam was then rushed to a nearby hospital.
Ale pokurwione, że 8000 osób na żywo to widziało i w sumie w telewizji też.
Unfortunately, despite going into surgery as quickly as possible, Adam couldn't survive the injury and passed away just hours later.
Ale chujowy
Matt was
przypadek.
arrested shortly after on suspicion that he had cut Adam on purpose.
No to chyba daleko idące.
However, investigators found no foul play in Adam's death and ultimately ruled it a tragic accident. The only silver lining in this entire
Nie no, to był wypadek, ale kurwa, jaki tragiczny, boże.
case is that it resulted in the English Ice Hockey Association making neck guards
Ciężko sobie wyobrazić, czy na miejscu takiego hokeisty, którego, wiesz, noga się o tę szyję otarła, to byś grał dalej. Bo to taki szok.
mandatory for all players, something that would have likely prevented this from happening altogether. But at the time, wearing this protective gear was only a suggestion.
Dziwne w sumie, że musiało dojść do czegoś takiego niestety, żeby rozkminili, że może jednak wypadałoby coś ochraniającego założyć.
On the evening of September 2, 2011, TVN, one of the biggest networks in Chile, was airing the latest episode of a show called Calle 7. It was a live game show where teams competed in various challenges to make their way to the top, and this weekend's episode was supposed to be no different. But things took a disturbing turn about halfway through the episode when the show's host interrupted the competitors seemingly out of nowhere and told them to stop.
Quiero que paren la competencia.
Oho.
Quiero que paren la competencia, por favor. Nos acaba de llegar una información muy difícil de entregar. No habíamos querido decir nada antes de chequear bien lo que estaba sucediendo porque compromete a personajes del canal, a personas muy queridas, a un equipo del canal, entre ellos Felipe Camiroaga y Bruce, Roberto Bruce, que también estaba en aquel vuelo a la isla de Juan Fernández, según tengo entendido. Es información que nos está llegando en este momento. El Ministerio de Defensa informó esta tarde el presidente de la República que un equipo de TVN iba al borde de una nave de la Fuerza Aérea de Chile que capotó en el archipiélago de Juan Fernández.
However, the reason for this interruption had nothing to do with the show itself. The host was talking about the C-212
właśnie.
Chilean Air
Gadał
Force
o
plane that
locie.
departed from the Arturo Merino Benitez International Airport earlier that day at around 2 p.m. It was headed for the Robinson Crusoe Airport, located hundreds of miles off the coast of Chile. Aboard was a full TV crew from the network, including the two renowned presenters, Felipe Camiroaga and Roberto Bruce. They were visiting Robinson Crusoe Island to report on the reconstruction after the 2010 earthquake. The flight started without a hitch. Unfortunately, as they were approaching the runway, the wind became extremely strong, making it impossible to land. The pilot tried
No
to
tak,
land
tylko to jest informacja o zdarzeniu, które jednak na żywo się nie pojawiło w kamerach, nie?
couple of times,
Chyba.
circling in the air after each attempt. However, on the third attempt, witnesses saw the plane lose altitude much faster than expected and crash into the ocean just a mile from the island. By the time rescuers reached the crash site, it was already too late. All 21 people aboard the C-212 plane had passed away. But while investigators initially believed that all of those deaths were due to the impact of the crash, the reality turned out to be far darker. As they were searching the wreckage, they found footage that one of the cameramen took of the interior shortly before the crash. The footage showed the passengers strapped into their
No i
seats,
z tą
completely
logiką, to
unaware of their
Smoleńsk tu
fate.
zaraz
But
powinien
the more
wlecieć.
haunting discovery happened when investigators found an SD card inside an empty water bottle floating near the crash site. This card contained
przykra
hundreds of
sytuacja.
images. However,
A!
analysis of these images
No i do-
showed that two of them were taken after the crash, including one of the plane's windows covered in water.
Jakieś
These
obrazy,
images
ale
put the
co?
crash into a whole new perspective. They showed that several passengers, including the cameraman who took these photos and preserved the SD card in the bottle, likely survived the initial crash. Sadly, they were trapped inside a rapidly sinking plane with no
Ja
way out,
pierdzielę.
forced to watch their aircraft fill up with water until there was no air left to breathe.
To jest oglądane, niepokojące nagrania z
Niagara Falls
telewizji.
is widely regarded as one of the world's most breathtaking natural wonders. However, while the surface is undeniably beautiful, the depths beneath the falls hide the disturbing history of many who lost their lives to the
No, lepiej się
currents.
tam nie
One
kąp,
such
nie?
incident
Tako.
was captured live on TV on May 30, 1985, when reporter Phil Kavitz was hosting a section about real estate in front of the falls. Suddenly, in the background, the
O
camera
kurwa.
captured a man caught in the current behind Phil. The rushing water carried him to
No
the edge of the
wbiegł tam.
falls before throwing him over the 170-foot drop. And while a lucky few have survived the fall from the Niagara Falls, he wasn't one of them. The treacherous terrain under the falls also made it difficult to retrieve his remains. Once recovered, investigators identified the man as 56-year-old Robert Ahrens and concluded that the act was deliberate. However, Robert was only one of the 5,000 bodies that have been recovered
Czyli to
from
jak
the foot
pod
of the
pociąg
falls in the
stwierdził, że
last
rzuci się do rzeki
175
rwącej.
years. Many of these 5,000 deaths were intentional, but there were a lot that weren't. And unfortunately, surviving a fall from Niagara Falls is near impossible. Once you fall in, the cold water makes it extremely difficult to breathe, making it even more challenging to swim to the surface. The water near the edge can also move at over 60 miles per hour, adding another layer of difficulty to an already impossible challenge. But the jagged rocks at the base of the falls is what marks the end for most people. On the 23rd of August 2010 at around 10 a.m., 21 tourists from Hong Kong returned to their tour bus after visiting the historic Fort Santiago in Manila, Philippines. They were also accompanied by 3 Filipino tour guides, and the trip had been going fantastic so far. But just as they were about to set out to the next location, they got interrupted by a middle-aged man in a police uniform. He was openly carrying multiple firearms, and his demeanor made it clear he wasn't afraid to use them either, something that became even more apparent as time went on. For now, things started off fairly calm, with him asking the driver for a ride to the next station. The bus driver tried to reject the request respectfully, explaining that he couldn't let him on because it was a private vehicle, not a public bus. However, the man wasn't having any of it. As soon as the bus driver rejected his request, he equipped one of his firearms and claimed that he was taking the bus hostage. This was 55-year-old Rolando Mendoza, a police officer with nearly 30 years of service. But he'd recently been fired over drug charges
Nie
that
wiem,
Rolando claimed
odjebało?
were
O co chodzi?
untrue. Getting fired left him with no pension after 3 decades of hard work. And while he tried to fight for his job through official means, his superiors wouldn't listen. In an act of desperation and defiance, Rolando took this bus full of tourists hostage
Chyba
and
są inne ścieżki niż takie coś.
presented a single demand. He wanted his job back. The situation so far
Jak masz dostać robotę z powrotem, jeżeli bierzesz autobus zakładników? Naprawdę myślisz, że co, że oddadzą ci robotę w policji za to? Przecież to jest najgłupsza możliwa logika. No gość jest chory na łeb.
looked fairly manageable, with 2 of his former colleagues establishing communications without any pushback. They were even able to convince him to release a few of the hostages. Granting his relatively simple demand would have been easy, but what followed was one of the biggest hostage disasters in the country's history, all because those in charge couldn't agree on the next move. Things started going downhill when Rolando's brother tried to approach the bus and was immediately detained by the officers. This made the already furious Rolando even angrier and more unstable. The situation only got worse once the media got involved. Nearly every news channel in the country started broadcasting the situation live. They talked about everything, including the plans officials were making outside. What they didn't know, however, was that the bus had a working TV and Rolando was watching and listening in on everything. This could have helped him formulate a plan and get what he wanted without hurting anyone. Unfortunately, the lackluster response from the officials made a peaceful resolution near impossible. His anger reached a boiling point when he saw how his brother was being treated by the police on live TV. This resulted in Rolando getting blinded by rage and opening fire on the hostages. Around the same time, the bus driver managed to free himself from the handcuffs Rolando put him in and escape through the driver's side door. Unfortunately, while he was able to remain unharmed, other hostages weren't as lucky, since, according to the bus driver, they were all dead, leaving Rolando alone in the bus. This revelation gave authorities the go-ahead to surround the bus and try to break in without any more casualties. But Rolando wasn't willing to go down without a
Na
fight.
pewno ci oddadzą robotę, gościu w policji, tak.
As soon as they tried to enter through the emergency exit, Rolando opened fire, hitting one officer on his bulletproof helmet and barely missing the others. So the officers thought of a different strategy. They flooded the back of the bus with tear gas, forcing him to the front, right into the crosshairs of a sniper, finally ending the hostage crisis. It wasn't until after his death that police realized the bus driver had misunderstood the situation and that 9 of the hostages were still alive. The massive loss of innocent lives broadcast live for the world to see, coupled with officials making wrong decisions at every turn, drew intense global scrutiny, marking this as one of the worst and most tragic incidents in
Ojebano, nie
Filipino
słyszałem o
history.
tym. Ja pierdzielę. Ale też niezłe łby. Transmitują, a nawet nie wiedzą, że w autokarze jest pierdolony telewizor i se chłop oglądał. Gdyby to się nie wydarzyło, no to nie dostałby takiego rage'a, nie? Może by jakoś szło się dogadać z nim. Jak to bywa z takimi zakapiorami, co mają zakładników. Ale też, że taki ziomek 30 lat pracował w policji i teoretycznie nic. I ta jedna rzecz go złamała, nie? Totalnie. Dziwne. Dziwny fest.